Welcome to the Humour in Games podcast, an analog and video games podcast about how humor is experienced, designed, and analyzed in games.
We are Scott DeYoung,
Mark Lajeunesse,
and Andre Zanescu,
and we'll be your guides in this 6-episode series. Throughout each episode, we'll break down different theories and forms of humor. We'll draw on interviews with designers, critics, and academics as they discuss the different aspects of humor, their own lived experiences, and how their work utilizes humor in games.
On this episode of the podcast, we speak to independent video game creator Karina Popp. We talk about parody in games, the humorous affordances of designing indie games, space cats, and strodes.
I'm Karina Popp. I'm a game developer based in New York City. I mostly make, I guess, what I would describe as kind of artsy, fartsy style small games. Some of the games I made are a game called 10 Mississippi that was nominated for an IGF, was at some festivals and stuff. I do some freelance work and I teach at a bunch of different game design programs in the city. Yeah, that's all about me, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking forward to kind of talking about some of these artsy-fartsy games as you describe them yourself today. But before, we like to ask everyone that comes on the podcast to talk about a game or a game moment that they find particularly funny or particularly humorous. So is there one that stands out for you?
This is tough because I think most games are funny. I think it would be easier for me to name a game I don't think is funny in particular. My instinct is to say frog fractions, how do you do it? Hatoful Boyfriend, a game that that's a comedy game. But when I really sat down to think about it, I think I would say The Sims is a game that's particularly funny to me. It's this perfect combination of funny content, just funny writing or funny things to do, and then this play space where you can do kind of silly and absurd things. And then the cherry on top, the most important thing to me is that there's a lot of bugs. There's a lot of room for the system to mess up and hilarious things to happen that weren't intended. It's in this golden area of funny for me.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting choice because a lot of people will talk about the slapstick ridiculousness of game physics, but I think The Sims has a lot of potential too to be really funny as a player too. And so as we kind of talk about humor today, how do you see it relating to the work that you do generally?
Yeah, I think that it's just a huge motivator for me. I think even if I make something that in the end isn't funny, it's often coming from a joke at some point. Which is weird because I think if a stranger were to look at my portfolio or look at my itch.io, they'd be oh, this girl just makes emo semi-autobiographical games. And I do put jokes in them, but I will fully acknowledge that any game I have that's publicly accessible is not very funny, or wouldn't fit into that genre of funny game. But on for me personally, I make a bunch of games that on my own that are funny. I think that the game space and the sort of potential of a digital space has so much room to do ridiculous things in it. And I want to experiment and explore and see what is possible. And then in the end, I'm really precious about those things. If I make something serious or that's exploring an idea and somebody doesn't understand it or doesn't vibe with it, I'm okay with that. But when I make something funny that's meant to make people laugh and people don't laugh, I will die. I will just perish. It's humor in my work is something that's really, really important to me, if that makes sense.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that awkwardness of telling a joke and then having people stare back at you and you're this was funny. I swear it's funny.
Let me explain it. That'll make it better.
I mean, I still stand by a good explained joke is great.
Yeah.
And so I guess because you were saying there's a lot of affordances that digital games have. Are there any in particular that you find yourself drawn to as a designer when you're thinking about funny things the graphics, the narrative, the mechanics? What kind of aspects do you typically try to insert humor into?
Sure. I think that the one I'm most drawn to just because it's the easiest, it's just writing like funny jokes occasionally. But the ones that I find most compelling are like the things that I think are funny in a really like holistic way that like are incorporating everything in the game together to create humor, or to create something that like you may not describe as humorous, but gives you that feeling, that sort of like that traditional like definition of humor as being like when you have an expectation and then that expectation is like subverted. There's I find it interesting to lean into that in games because so much of games are like built around this idea of like players having a grasp on the expectations of the system and the interaction. And I like the idea of like playing around with like overturning that and like not meeting a player's expectation. And I personally find that to be hilarious, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could maybe speak to an example because I was looking a little bit through your portfolio and there's so many games that have such a change on how we would naturally think about engaging with game systems. And so I'm wondering if there's like one example of either game that you've made or if you want to talk about someone else's game, that's fine too. But that kind of really exemplifies this.
Sure. So I mentioned 10 Mississippi when I was like giving my about me spiel, which again to me is a game that falls into that like emo, like semi-autobiographical realm. But I have a bunch of things in there that I think are kind of silly and funny and subverting what you expect to happen. So like for example, like there's like a scene, and in the game it's like a series of 10-second like vignettes with a very simple interaction of a very boring thing during a day, like making some ramen, eating your ramen, riding the subway. And there's a point where you're checking your email and the email that you're looking at is just like a reminder about paying your student loans, and the text of the email is very cringy, and I don't even think like you have 10 seconds. Most people probably can't even read it, and your only interactive like thing that you have to do is hit the delete key. And if you delete it, if you just hit it once, it'll like get rid of the email. But if you just like keep repeatedly pressing delete, the computer that you're on will just blue screen and will break. So stuff like that. I think also like in one of my favorite moments in it that like one person found funny, and it was the most gratifying thing to me, was near the end of the game, there's a scene where you're essentially masturbating. You're like reading some fanfic, and you just have to repeatedly press the O key through this scene. And again, the fanfic text is like really cheesy and silly, and no one had ever mentioned it to me. Like no, like had pointed out like, oh, is that masturbating, or like what's going on in that scene? But I was showing the game at GDC, and there was, there's like a bunch of people that come up and play your game, and it's mostly dudes that were playing it. And then at some point one day, this woman comes and she plays it, and she gets to that scene and she pauses and she turns around and looks at me with like kind of this like conspiratorial look and is like, is that what I think it is? And I'm like, yeah. And then she just starts laughing, and that was the best. I was really, really happy with that, because in a game that was otherwise kind of like, I don't know, straight-laced, I guess, to have that scene to me was hilarious. I'm glad that this like one woman like got the joke and was into it.
No, I think that's really funny, especially in the context of like GDC, where like there's people milling about and you just have this like person spamming the O key.
Yes.
I think that's amazing. And I mean, speaking a little bit about kind of the conventions you've been to, you've mentioned Games for Change, which is a pretty big organization, especially in the world that I'm in as well. And those games are serious games, they're educational games, they're games with purpose. And so how does humor kind of fit into those sometimes more serious design spaces? How do you kind of see comedy and jokes fitting into these games for change style of design?
I think that they're, from my perspective, one of the more compelling like methods within that sphere of games for change. I come from like a background of like, growing up watching like The Daily Show and The Colbert Report, and reading The Onion. Like a lot of my politics, like as a kid, and my interest in like social justice came from reading and consuming humorous satirical content. And so like I have a natural affinity for it, and will like advocate for that. I think like, there was within game studies, and then like the people that would make games and do game studies, not naming names, had this idea of like, oh, I'm going to make a game that has a system in it and it's like factually based and it's going to convince somebody, like you're going to play around with this world, and it'll be this argument for why you should believe this thing or think about this thing. And that's not really very successful and has the potential to backfire. Whereas humor is partially just kind of an emotional appeal, and that kind of more like rhetorical device of appealing to somebody based on their feelings, I think is more effective, especially now in a world in which so many people are like basing their political opinions and views of the world on their feelings rather than like data or facts. I think it's much stronger to make a joke or kind of on the like related, but quite the opposite. I also think like simply making an empathetic appeal, like showing someone's perspective is effective. Being really like vulnerable and showing like the life of a person. And then on the opposite side of that coin to me is humor, like thinking of something like it's barely a game, but like the Thoughts and Prayers Flash game, that is a direct response to the very common occurrence of mass shootings in America, when politicians or other leaders will say something like, oh, thoughts and prayers with the victims. And so in this game, you just press a button that produces thoughts and prayers, meant to be like, this is useless. Like without action, this is useless. For me, the way that like sort of manifests in what I do is that like I want to use that in kind of a meta way. So I worked on a game a while ago called Political Dolphin, which was like a point and click adventure game that was about a dolphin who wanted global warming to happen because the dolphin said that there would be more water in the ocean to swim in. And then all the humans that the dolphin is trying to convince throughout this game are like, but dolphin, the ocean will turn to acid. Like you will not like this. And it was about that very like meta idea of like, the dolphin's opinions aren't really based on reality. And then in the end, you find out like the dolphin is paid off by oil lobbies or something. So it's, I don't know, I guess like I personally think humor in the context of something that is trying to make a change in the world is really strong, I guess. Like, I don't know. I think that those are the best kinds of games for change.
No, I think humor, and it's something that I think you put really nicely, but a lot of other people have touched on in our podcast episodes, kind of has this really evocative place in games where when used wisely, like having a dolphin that is trying to convince people to increase global warming can bring people into this larger argument, which I think is really cool and wonderful about the work that you're doing. And I also have to kind of call you out a little bit here because I was looking at your Twitter and kind of prepping for our conversation today, and your bio says, I make no fun games. And I feel like in your discussion here, some of these games sound a little bit more fun than perhaps you're leading on. So could you kind of explain a little bit what you mean by like no fun games and if or how that might relate to humor?
Yeah, so I mean, partially that is that is me being like preemptively defensive. Because again, I think any game that if you went to my itch to go play, like I would not describe any of them as fun. Like they're not fun at all. They're me being like overly intellectual or just like messing around with code. And then, but I would also say that I think not fun things are funny. Like I think boring things are funny. I think that there's this tendency, and I do find it amusing, but there's this tendency in games to like go for the really like off the wall funny things. Like I love things like Goat Simulator, like physics simulation things are hilarious. Like all these funny things will happen in them. The goat is bouncing off of things. The tongue is stuck to things it shouldn't be. But like, the tiny boring things in life to me are funny too. Like I kind of like Waiting for Godot kind of perspective on humor, just like mundane modernity kind of style of humor, which to me is funny, but I also think not traditionally what people would say is fun, I guess.
For sure, and I think it's really cool how we can see humor kind of exist on both ends of the spectrum, right? The absolute crazy in those spaces of boredom. And I think you actually wrote banality in one of your descriptions on your games, which I think is a really nice term to describe what you were saying there. But you also included that with terms like body and parody. And I wonder kind of where you see specifically bodies in terms of humor in the design work that you're doing. Like what is that word referencing there?
Um, Mostly referencing the sort of normative way we think about bodies in digital space. I presented a paper on the subject Digra a few years ago, but it's an idea that I think a lot of people have talked about, that like when we see bodies, again, particularly like in those physics simulation games, they are toying with the idea of what a body is and what it has to be. And as can be the case in many different fields, like that can manifest in a sort of like cathartic humorous way of like heart surgeon simulator, like I can't control my hands and that's funny. And I think it's partially funny because like we always use the body as a tool in games, like it's sort of flattened into something that can pick up things, that can walk, that can hold something, that can jump. But we have the capability to use what we think of as a body in like unthinkable ways, like so much more than the way that we often see the body used. And so I like to explore like what different ways we can do that. Like one small experiment that I have that um, again, I don't know if like some people probably wouldn't call it a game, but it's just like meant to evoke the feeling of like picking your cuticles, and you're just essentially removing a pixel from a finger every click, and then like a little bit of blood spurts out. Um, Sort of like this playing with this like pleasure of self-destruction almost, that again, like I just don't see in games, and I wish I could see more of. Bodies are cool and funny and interesting, and I don't think we lean into that enough as game developers.
I have to say, when you were describing the blood spurting out after picking a cuticle, I had a little bit of a like an evocative reaction to like, oh, but in like in the right ways that's like there for. And also because you've said now twice, I don't know if this counts as a game. For our podcast, we're counting it all as games. We're not
Okay,
going to do the
sorry.
semantics, so don't worry about that moving forward. But yeah, the cuticle is very satisfying. It's like the idea that I was getting as you were talking about it. But I kind of want to focus in on. I mean, there's so many of your games, but there was one that really stood out to me when I was going through your page, which was this game called Space Kitty. And I was wondering, just because I know how many people online love cats, but also I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Space Kitty as a game, your inspirations of it, and kind of where humor sits in that game. Just I could try to explain it, but I feel like it's best heard from you.
Sure. So Space Kitty is a game in which you are tasked with protecting an almighty space kitty. You protect the space kitty from dog aliens, aka doglians, and you have to do it using light. So on the technical side, the game just uses a webcam, picks up a certain like threshold of light that we'll see in the room, and you like use the flashlight on your phone or just a regular flashlight to move it around the screen and shoot or zap the doglians. Which I mean, you mentioned like internet cats, and like I would love to say that I had a more interesting point of inspiration, but it was internet cats. Like the person I was working on it with, and we actually had to do we had to make a game for an assignment, and we had procrastinated. It was like the last minute, it was really late, and we were just like slap happy, and we discovered this light thing, and we were like, oh, can we make something from this? Like, let's do it, but what are we doing with the light? And then I, you know, like the whole like meme of like cats in space shooting lasers out of their eyes. It was like, what if it's a kitten in space and you must protect them? Like just fully just things that we thought were hilarious, and like that's it. It's unfortunately not deep at all.
Oh, but I love it. I mean, I watched the trailer for it, and I mean, the idea of just it's just the art alone is just fantastically ridiculous. And Doglians as a concept, I really appreciate. So I thought that was a really great piece there. And I mean, it's one of the many games that you've made, and the games that you're making, as you self-described, are artsy fartsy. And so how do you see your games differing kind of from like those mainstream big titles, some of which we've mentioned in the conversation today, but like those AAA games out there? Like where do you see kind of humor in the work that you can do as more of an indie or independent designer compared to those larger companies?
um it's a good question. And it's tough, and I have feelings and thoughts. uh that I have like a lot more freedom to kind of do what I want and pursue what I think is interesting, um, in a way that like a AAA game can't. And my method of creation is very much like, I don't know, it's like selfish and we're looking at a lot of things. Like I just make things that I think are funny, which I think is freeing when it comes to humor. Because I think in a lot of ways, like making something funny is somewhat not entirely mutually exclusive from the concept of design, but they're two categories of things that I think it's really, really difficult to bring together. Whereas I don't really view what I do as design at all, and kind of have this space that I can make something that I think is funny or interesting or clever. And if nobody else thinks that, it's fine because I'm not making a product. I don't have to sell anything. Um, I guess the downfall of that is that there are a lot of expectations about what a game should be that are going to inform like who it gets it or wants to play it or is interested. And so it's kind of like this precarious balance of like, exploring tools and ideas that I think are funny or interesting, but also like kind of trying to entice people and like pay attention to me. Like, so it's not entirely just like this totally like, I don't know, like autophilic, like I'm just doing what I want thing.
Right, and I'm curious because there was another game that I was like, and anyone listening, you should go check out Karina's Itch. But there was another game that I was laughing about with Mark and Andre just because the art for it was called Party Baby, and the art for that game is just hilarious. Um, but there's a piece there in that game where you reference like the people who inspired you, right? Like I think it was like your friend's infant or something was like a big inspiration for the game. And so I wonder how much like the people you're designing with impact the humor, or the people maybe you're designing for impact the humor that you're trying to put into these games.
Like in the case of Party Baby, it actually features like some audio design, like from Naomi Clark's infant at the time, who I don't know, I think she said like she would cry whenever she had her diaper changed. And so they just had a lot of this audio and I happened to need it. And I had been working on the game prior to that. But it was during this time when a lot of people I knew were having kids. So it was sort of something on my mind. And I was like, there aren't very many games about that experience that I'm watching people I know go through that show like more of like a chaotic or messy side to it, if that makes sense. Like if you think about taking care of a baby in a game, most of the examples I can think of are going to be like pet games like Tamagotchis and stuff, or again like The Sims, where it's typically like a very like robotic, like feed the baby, pick up the baby's poop, all that stuff. But I'm watching people with kids and it's like messy and really gross. And I wanted to kind of take that, what I was seeing and hearing about, and convey it with like the art that you mentioned, like was very much intentionally like I was trying to go for like the like 90s sort of like Ren and Stimpy, like Nicktoon-ish, semi-grotesque cartoony style. That to me is sort of what it sounded like having a kid was like, that it was like, pleasing and wonderful and everything, but also like, you also sometimes get poop on your hands sometimes. Like it's also like a little bit gross. So I definitely like draw inspiration from the people around me. If it makes them laugh, I hope it does. I don't know. I don't want to make it sound like I'm like making fun of other people or anything. I swear. I don't know. The world is funny, I guess.
No, I totally agree. There's moments to laugh in most situations, even if it's not appropriate at all times. And I kind of to that point of like parody or kind of reflecting the world in a different angle. Do you find that as like an independent designer, you can do that with like concepts that like a AAA company couldn't? I mean, you mentioned like spamming the O key, which I can't imagine. I mean, I can see some AAA companies producing a game that lets you do that, but are there moments that you have where you can kind of almost make parody or make fun of kind of these larger titles that exist?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's especially making parody that is more biting, like you said, like they're like you could see a Grand Theft Auto like having some kind of masturbation joke, like not like directly showing it, but like having some kind of reference to it that's supposed to be like kind of like body and make you laugh. But or like you see like, I mean, a number of games that are meant to be like, your Duke Nukem's, like making fun of existing genre or something, but it's always kind of like in good fun ribbing, I guess. I think that there's more room for an independent developer to make games that are more self-critical of the industry. When I got my master's thesis at the NYU Game Center, my thesis was on parody in games. And part of it was I made a game that I called Candy Crunch, that was basically you're playing a match 3 game making candy, like Candy Crush. But eventually the candies disappear. They stop coming, and what you have to do is essentially go into this factory and make the candy yourself. Like you have to go through all these steps to like create like the candy juice, to like mold the candy, and then after like 5 minutes you have one candy that then goes to the screen, and now you can build up some more candy to get to play the game again, which was very much like me trying to comment on like play as labor, like the idea of like a lot of like free to play games simply being a form of labor. Like it's less, their existence is less about having this fun experience for the player and more about like getting people hooked onto it so that the company can make money off of it. So I like, that's not something that I can see flying necessarily at a larger company. And I think it's useful. Not that like I've made anything I would necessarily say is particularly useful, but I think it's a space that is good for like the industry to be critical of itself, and for artists to be critical of this larger industrial the industrial gaming complex that we live in.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really like a nice way to put it, in terms of there are a lot of issues that at least you as an independent designer can start to kind of take a jab at. And you've done that with some of your games, both towards the game industry, but beyond that, which is fantastic to see. And just as we're kind of coming to the end of our episode today, I was wondering if there was a game that you particularly wanted to highlight when we're talking about Humour, or there's a project you have upcoming that you wanted to highlight. I don't want to force you to disclose all of your designer secrets, but just as a kind of a nice ending note to talk about today.
Yeah, no. Another benefit of being an indie developer is, for the most part, I don't have NDAs. I don't care. I'll tell you all about what I'm working on. No, so one game I've been working on that I think fits really well with this is a game that's meant to be about like, are you familiar with the concept of Strodes?
Why don't you explain it for the
Okay.
audience member who isn't familiar?
Okay. So like it's a street and a road combined that like as infrastructure, like I think it's like roads are for transporting things and transporting goods, and like streets are for human beings to move between. And in North America, we just have like these, what this person that came up with this term called Strodes, where it is both transporting things and people, and it does both really crappily. And growing up in like the middle of America, where there is no sort of like public space or infrastructure, I was thinking about this concept and like how much it kind of sucks to be a kid in one of these spaces. Like there's nowhere to play or go. So I am making a game that's, just sort of like a walking simulator where you're outside in this long, never-ending road full of houses, suburban houses that all look exactly the same. And you're following like this red light that keeps flashing. And there are cars, so you can't go in the street or you'll get hit. You can't go in the lawns because all of the like the waspy people will be like, get off my lawn. So you keep walking, going towards this red light until eventually you sort of hit this highway that feeds all of the cars in. And you see across the street that the red light that you were following was just Walmart. So it's just like a one-note joke about like the nothingness of being a kid in suburbia. I guess back to that idea of like banality and things that kind of aren't very funny and kind of maybe depressing. But yeah, that's one thing that I'm working on that kind of fits here.
That hits really close to home, because I grew up in suburbia where like the only thing to do was to go to like a Walmart where you maybe had like a few quarters and you could try to use those machines if it was like a good day.
Yeah.
So I love it as an idea, and I look forward to seeing it come out. And everyone listening, you should go check out all of Karina's stuff and check that out as well. But that's the end of the episode today. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, and for talking with you. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
That was our talk with Karina Popp. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on the Humor in Games podcast.